verses 38 through 50. We're going to finish up Matthew 12. And we'll probably stay in Matthew through the end of the year, and then we're going to start on 1 Corinthians. And I'm hoping to get our brother Keith Nail to tag team with me, so that'll be good. Matter of fact, I might just tag him in and just disappear. Yeah, you do know where I live, don't you? So, looking forward to that. And but that'll start sometime after the first of the year, probably first or second week of January, after everybody being gone and coming back and missing and staying and traveling and all that. Everything settles down. We'll be doing that. So, Matthew chapter 12, 38 through the end of the chapter, which is 50. Already? Did I bore you already? How can that possibly? I just stood up here. How can that possibly be? All righty. If I can find my other spectacles. Then certain of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, Master, we would see a sign from thee. But he answered and said unto them, an evil and adulterous generation seeking after a sign, and there shall be no sign given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was in 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh shall rise in judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, a greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south shall rise up in judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it. For she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, a greater than Solomon is here. When the unclean spirit is gone out of a man, he walks through dry places, seeking rest, and finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from whence I came out. And when he is come, he finds it empty, swept, and garnished. Then goes he in, and taketh with himself 7 other spirits, more wicked than himself, and they enter in and dwell there. And the last state of the man is worse than the first. Even so shall it be also unto this wicked generation. While he was talking to the people, behold, his mother and brethren stood without, desiring to speak with him. Then one said to him, behold, your mother and brethren stand without, desiring to speak with you. But he answered and said unto him, who is my mother? And who are my brethren? And he stretched forth his hand towards his disciples and said, behold, my mother and my brethren. For whosoever shall do the will of my Father which is in heaven, the same is my brother and sister and mother. So there's a lot going on. I say that a lot, don't I? Because there's a lot going on in Matthew. And as we look at the very first part of that section, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they want a sign, which seems like a reasonable request. We want a sign from you. Now, Jesus has been performing these miracles and signs, and in Matthew 12, 38, the Pharisees answered they want to see a sign from Jesus. So what's the big deal? Why doesn't Jesus just simply perform a sign for anyone who asks? Why would this request bring forth the lesson through all of Matthew 12, but through the end of Matthew 12? Why would that be a lesson to us and to those that were listening? Well, first off, we need to remember that this is not a new section of Scripture. This is not a new time frame in which Jesus is asked this question. He had just healed the guy that was blind. And so this is the same audience that's been with us for at least the last half of chapter 12. Instead of the scribes and Pharisees answering what Jesus said, remember that Jesus has healed a demon-oppressed man that was blind and mute. We need to remember that. People are now wondering if Jesus was the Messiah, and we talked about that last week. And the Pharisees are rejecting this, proclaiming that Jesus is doing miracles by the power of Satan, and we talked about that last week. And Jesus has just, all the way through here, has talked about how that's an impossible thing for the house divided and all those things. He's also talked about the fruit. He was very clear as to the fruit shows the tree. Good fruit, good tree. Bad fruit, bad tree. The heart, good or evil. And so he's conquered Satan. And we see that the Pharisees' fruit is not good fruit. And so they are found worthy of judgment in the last part of the lesson from last week. So, teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. Okay? After all that's happened up until this point, they just throw that in there. Now think about that for a second. Jesus healed the guy that was blind and mute. He can now see and speak. Jesus just gave them a sign. Okay? And this sign, healing of this demon-oppressed man, was on such a scale that the crowd was saying, this is the Son of David. This must be the Messiah. It has to be. Just you look at the evidence with open eyes and open heart. It has to be.
Another thing, John, is he's doing it by his own authority and power.
Right.
He's not praying
to have it done like a prophet. Right. He's not calling down from heaven.
But I've got one other comment, one other thought, and I'd like your opinion.
You say that with some confidence. I'm not sure you want my opinion, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think when a lot of times on occasion, not a lot, on occasion, Jesus said he knew their thoughts or he knew their hearts. I think Jesus being the Son of God, I think there was a supernatural element to that. I think he knew what they were thinking.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I would stand exactly with you that Jesus knew the hearts of men. He knew the hearts of good men. He knew the hearts of bad men. He knew. That was a knowledge that carried throughout his ministry of the things that were going to be done. He knew Judas, and he told him to go. He knew what was going to happen. Go ahead, Mark.
He also didn't want to do it for a show.
Oh, absolutely. And we're going to get to that. Right. And there was a reason, there was a reason for it, and we're going to get to that as we go through this. So, Jesus had been performing all kinds of miracles for the purpose of showing who he is, as a proof of who he is. Now, he's not said who he is. He was letting the crowds gather that information on their own. From his fruit, they could see and claim, we're starting to make these claims, and based on his miracles and his teachings and his, just his attitude, I think. I find a lot of his attitude in Matthew is endures me to him. I don't know how to explain that, but he was just and is supposed to be, but the epitome of good and kind and loving and all of those things. So, so Jesus says in verse 39, an evil and adulterous generation seeks a sign. And we have to wonder, what's the problem? The problem was not desiring verifiable proof of who Jesus is. Okay? And that's what it sounds like. We want you to prove that you are who the crowds say you are.
Well, they said he do miracles because they said he was doing it.
Right.
Well, they knew that he was doing it.
And now they're flipping their script on him, and now they want a miracle for themselves. They want him to Now he's a dog and pony show, and they want him to do something for them. And so the problem is not desiring proof of who Jesus is. That's not the problem. Jesus is already performing miracles that prove who he is. And the apostles, we know later on that the apostles will do exactly the same thing. They'll do likewise and prove the message that they proclaim. That's all through the book of Acts. So the problem is not wanting this verifiable proof. That's not what Jesus is condemning. The problem is that Jesus is doing the signs, but those signs aren't enough. These opponents to what he's doing have already condemned him. They want something more. They're telling Jesus that what he's done is not sufficient. Okay? They're telling Jesus that it's almost like they're not even acknowledging what's been done up until that point. Now they want to, it's almost like command him, a command performance to prove who he was, not based on what they've already seen. And we know that still happens today. People still make the same proclamations about God. Okay? That happens today, and we all know it. They say, we would believe if. I would believe if. If God performed some particular sign that I want to see, then I would believe, for sure. But Jesus calls us evil and adulterous. Why? Well, because the problem is not the evidence, but the heart that wants to reject that evidence. Okay? They're not looking for a way to believe that he is who he is. They're looking for a way to discount or discredit or just have a reason to not believe he is who he says he is. Because that would... Did that do it louder all of a sudden? Anyway, that would...
Remember in the Gospel of John, that he said, if you don't believe me, believe my son.
Right.
And he's talking to them.
He is. And he's saying, what he's saying is it's never enough. It will never be enough. Okay? Jesus says this is because the problem is not the evidence, but the heart that wants to reject it. Do you think if Jesus performed another miracle in front of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, that now all of a sudden they would just believe? Okay? No, absolutely not. And if you do think they would have, you didn't read what he had already done. That was sufficient for everybody but them. Okay? And so they saw all kind of miracles.
Moses had the same trouble with Pharaoh.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I've seen every one of them, but still didn't.
Yeah, Jim Lehman said, Moses had the same issue with Pharaoh. The signs would come. Pharaoh would start to crack a little bit, and it'd harden his heart, and things would get worse. And so, in this particular instance, Jesus knows their thoughts. He knows their position. He knows who they are. And I guess it sounds more lawyer-like. I need specific evidence. Although they'd seen all the evidence. None of it was circumstantial. It was all hard evidence that he was who he was, but it sounds more intellectual. So the evidence is not the problem. The problem is you think you can tell God what he needs to do for you to make you believe. How many times do we hear you in that? Okay? And I would say we all have been there. You think you can tell God what he needs to do for you to make you believe. An evil heart says, God must do something for me. An evil heart said, God must meet me on my terms. An evil heart says, I will not believe until God does what I want him to do. Jesus just cuts through all that facade and just shows what the real issue is. But notice what Jesus says he will do. Okay, in verse 39. Jesus has one more sign that's going to be the game changer for all people. No sign will be given except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Just as Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights, Jesus will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and nights. Jesus' great sign will be his resurrection 3 days after his death. Resurrection is the sign for belief. Every person has to grapple with this sign. Jesus rose from the dead. What are you going to do with that information? There are hundreds of witnesses for the resurrection of Jesus, and none of the opponents up until that point could deny it. Jesus' point is very simple. If the resurrection does not generate belief, no sign will. Nothing will. Okay? His resurrection is the only necessary sign. Okay? Obviously, it wasn't the only sign, but it was the only necessary sign. The people of Nineveh would condemn this generation because they repented at Jonah's preaching. And Jesus obviously is far greater than Jonah. And it's important that we understand that who Nineveh was. You know, they were the capital of the Assyrian nation, the empire. And they were a ruthless, wicked empire. But they repented when Jonah came. Jesus has come, those who are not ruthless Gentiles, but those who are supposed to be the holy people of God. But they are not repenting, but rejecting Jesus. Okay? So he's comparing this generation to the generation they know from history that believed God's prophet, that believed what was preached to them. And they would know, and if you think about it, you know, the preaching of Jonah, they didn't have that miracle to back it up. They didn't know he was in the belly of a whale in the belly of a fish for 3 days in Nineveh. They didn't know that. They just recognized the message. They believed and repented, and they were spared. And so Jesus also talks about in the days of Solomon. We read about the Queen of the South traveling from a great distance to hear Solomon's wisdom. She also was a Gentile, but she understood the need to go to Solomon. And Jesus is clearly greater than Solomon, and yet these people are unwilling to come to him and listen to what he is teaching. Okay? They come with a preconceived notion and an evil heart. Okay? They don't come open and ready to learn or even to discuss. You'll notice that there was never any discussion. It was just condemnation, or they were just ready to attack at any moment about anything Jesus had to say. And we understand that the Queen of the South came to listen, to garner knowledge and information. Something greater than Jonah and Solomon is here. But you're rejecting him, proclaiming that you need him to do something more. What more do you want Jesus to do? What more do you think would truly be enough? Okay? And there's no answer to that question because it would never be enough. And so that's where we find ourselves as we go into verse 43. Because it seems like Jesus just switched gears. He just changed topics. Jesus starts talking about unclean spirits leaving a person and coming back. That's not a discussion really about unclean spirits. Rather, the truth about unclean spirits is being used to illustrate the rejection problem that's happening within the people that are rejecting Christ. The rejection problem from their heart shows the cleansing and purging that happened in the person, but the house, the person, remained empty, only allowing 7 more spirits to return. And what does all that mean to us? We'll get to that a little bit, but
They were asking for a sign after he was resurrected.
absolutely.
There just a few hours. He was there for weeks.
Yeah.
So they knew that he was resurrected.
So at the end of verse 45, Jesus says, "So also will it be with this evil generation." And Jesus is applying that towards their rejection of him in this illustration, their rejection. Because they've been purged of wickedness, but spiritual life has not replaced it. Okay, that's the thing. This is a picture of a person who has experienced a great act of God, but has not responded to it. Since the occupied house is left empty, the person has learned nothing and is still subject to the same demonic influence. The tragedy is that by not responding, the opportunity for a permanent reversal is lost, and failure to have God enter in has left the person in peril. And that was from Bach back in 1093. But that's Israel's problem. I don't know how many in here go to the class on Sunday evenings, but Israel, we're in Ezra and Nehemiah and in that area, Haggai and Zechariah, but we haven't gotten there yet, but that's where we're at. Israel has been purged and cleansed through their exile, but the people remained spiritually empty and had not replaced their sinning with a full life in God. Now their condition is worse than it was before. When we read in Ezra and Nehemiah, you can see that this was the condition of the people. They'd stopped some sins that had brought their exile punishment. Okay, they'd stopped that. Okay, but they hadn't purged and renewed with a new heart to seek the love of God. They said it was not time to build the Lord's house, but devoted themselves to worrying about their own houses. And that's in Haggai. It was to such a point that Malachi notes that the people were saying, it is a weariness to go to the temple with their worship and sacrifices. Okay. It's just way too much work to praise God. Way too much work to worship. We're just going to put that off to the side. We're going to do our stuff, and then, if we get around to it, we'll come back once a month, once a year, whenever. That's good enough. We can do that and still be right where we need to be. Does that sound familiar with the world we live in today? There you go. So, why is it worse now than it was? Because now they're self-deceived. Now you're not doing certain sins, so you think you're close to God because you're not as bad as the world. And this is all going to sound real familiar to the lives we live today. Okay, you think you're close to God because you're not as bad as the world. You think you're close to God. The problem is that they had not recommitted their life to having a deep devotion to God. And this is directly stated to us. We can cleanse ourselves of evil acts and sin, but there's not a commitment to truly devote ourselves to Jesus, our life is going to be a spiritual wreck. Okay? We can stop, and usually it's the sin that's been pointed out to us, but we can stop whatever it may be. But if we don't replace that with something, that's where the difficulty comes in. Okay? There's a void in your life, and if it's not filled by Jesus, it's going to be filled with something. Okay? And you've heard it said on different platforms that, you know, they're just looking for something. Everybody's looking for something. Okay? And it may be the first thing they find. You know, drugs and alcohol may be the first thing they find. You know, embezzlement at work may be the first thing they find. But something is going to fill that void. And God is not looking for hollow shells of people who have stopped certain moral behaviors. Okay? That's not enough. God is looking for people whose hearts are filled with a love for Him. Israel's only gone halfway. They purged some sins, but they didn't fill their lives with devotion to God. So now their condition is worse because they couldn't see the saving work that Jesus had come to do. So without being filled with knowledge and love of God, we're going to end up in a state of rejecting God. And this is how these religious leaders completely missed Jesus and rejected Him. And Peter talks about it also in 2 Peter. But now when Jesus is in the middle of talking, he gets interrupted, somebody comes in, and a message is given to him that his mother and brothers are looking for him and want to talk to him. Who is my mother and who are my brothers? Jesus said. He stretched out his hand and said, everyone who does the Father's will is his family, his brothers and sisters and mother. So who belongs to God's family? Now, if you're at this time and you're an Israelite, you know exactly who God's family is, you know. But Christ is not talking about bloodlines or genealogy, because that's what Israel would have been looking towards and focused on. They thought they were God's family just because they were physical descendants of Abraham. And we talked about John the Baptist back in Matthew 3. He told them not to say that they have Abraham as their father. That's not how a person belongs to God's family. Any person who does not reject but does the Father's will belongs in the family of God. And so, I need to quit pushing that button. And, you know, we see that, I don't know, I've read it a lot. And I don't think I ever saw it as an interruption to what was going on. Like it interrupted his train of thought that his mother and brothers were there, I just saw it as just more information that just happened to come at that time, you know. But it's not just a random interruption. Just like the unclean spirit illustration, Jesus is also illustrating the new situation that he's created. Before, what made you belong to God's family was having a physical bloodline to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But now, Jesus has come to create a new family that is not bound by the blood of Abraham. Jesus' new family is bound by the blood of Jesus. So, as we follow Jesus, we enter into a new family. And we need to see each other this way. I thought this was I don't know. I may fall into this category, so maybe that's why I don't recognize it. So let me read this sentence really slowly. Other Christians are not just a Sunday nuisance, okay? Other Christians are not just a Sunday nuisance. We are pictured as being deeply connected together in fellowship, in love, and one family, and all connected in Jesus. And so I thought that was an interesting statement. I guess that could possibly be the case. I'm a lot to deal with. Trust me. You can ask me. I'm a lot. And so I may be one of those nuisance. And not know it. I wouldn't know. Melissa has to say stuff to me every once in a while about what I've said or done, and it's just I'm oblivious. Because first off, it's a gender thing. We're just oblivious. Men are just oblivious. But sometimes it's just to others it feels blatant, and to me it doesn't even tick on my radar at all. And so it's.
I think that's a worldwide thing between men and women.
Oh, absolutely. It's just we're just different. But so. As we look at each other, as we learn to love each other in a family way, it's important for us not to consider each other a nuisance. And I don't know that nuisance is a bad thing. We all have family members that are nuisance, right?
You can be a good nuisance or a bad
Absolutely. And that could be depending on which day it is, And so as we learn to love one another and we find a bond in this place and away from this place, it's important to remember if we do become annoyed, which, that'll happen. It's when you put a whole bunch of people in one room, somebody or a bunch of people are going to get annoyed. Somebody talks too loud. Somebody talks too much. Somebody doesn't filter what actually comes from here out. But we need to remember God's love for us and our love for one another. Okay. First, don't reject Jesus because you think he needs to further prove himself. It's one of the pictures that Jesus is bringing together. Jesus has done more than any person could ever do, and we know that his greatest proof is his resurrection. The whole of our faith stands on the resurrection of Jesus. That's all the evidence we need to follow him. Do not have an evil heart that rejects his signs, thinking he should do something special for you. Okay? Be warned about how we can slide into a heart of rejection. Following Jesus is far more than just stopping some immoral behaviors. Fighting against sin will be futile and leave our house empty if we don't fill that void with the love and knowledge of Christ. We should set our minds on things above and press into spiritual pursuits so that the end doesn't end up being worse than the first. We should be filled with the new life that Jesus is offering. We should see the result of joining with Christ, the result of entering in a family. You're not just part of a church. Giving your life to Jesus is not like joining a club. Okay? This is entering into the family of God. A family filled with people spread all over the world with the same faith and the same struggles as you. We need to continually monitor our heart, be willing to set forth changes in our behavior, and immerse ourselves in this imperishable kingdom of God, and this eternal family that we have. And try not to be the nuisance. And that's where I'm going to work on. I'm going to work on trying not to be the nuisance. I never even considered that statement before I read this lesson. I never even considered it. And now,
we all need somebody to be with, so that helps us expect and love.
it also helps us feel better about ourselves. And family is has such a wide array of definition, of connotation, even, because some of us didn't have a good family. That's just part of growing up in the world. And so your definition of family and my definition of family may be completely skewed. How some families resolve conflict is different than the family that goes out in the backyard and has a fist fight. It's just different. Some people talk, some people do. And so some people ignore and isolate. Some families hug it out. Not us. We weren't that hug it out type. But it takes all types for a family to be a cohesive unit with one goal, in one mind and heart, to be dedicated and immersed in having the vision of doing what God would have us to do. And not only doing what God would have us to do, you helping me do what God would have me to do. And me helping you do what God would have you to do. And so, as we finish up with Matthew chapter 12, behold, my brothers and sisters, my fathers and mothers. It's important. Christ made an effort for us to understand that it's important, okay? We're not an island, okay? We're a family. And, how we lift each other up, how we encourage one another, how we live with one another should always be focused on trying to take everybody with us when we go to heaven. And so, think about that this week as I know, pictured family members when I said every family's got a nuisance member. And so maybe pray for that family member. Maybe pray for yourself to understand that family member better. Maybe pray for yourself to understand a family member here better and get to know them better. And so next week, we're going to be in chapter 13. We're going to stay in Matthew probably till through the end of the year so we can start in 1 Corinthians, like I said, and Brother Keith is going to help me tag team through that. And so looking forward to that. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your presence and your encouragement.
John, one of the most fascinating courses I ever took in college was a